Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today we're going to go over the second article that I couldn't share with you guys during the live stream. And this one's a little bit different than what I typically go over, as this one has more to do with Freemasonry and the occult history of the early days of the United States. And I thought this was a pretty interesting article. I thought it's got a nice mix of history and conspiracy and especially American history. I'm really fascinated with American history as well, although it's not as ancient as other things that some of you guys are really into. It's still very interesting because the history of the United States itself is just there's so much going on. There's so many moving parts. There's a lot to tell, and then there's a lot to still find out, I think. And and this article comes from history.com, and I just thought it was a pretty cool transfer of information. I know history.com is not without its faults, and I think everything should be taken with a grain of salt in this article, but it's fun. It's fun to talk about. It's fun to speculate what's true and what wasn't. And I think in this case especially, there's a lot of parallels that we can draw into the present day. So anyway, the title. Also, I want to go over some comments if I have time at the end that have been brought to my attention from the last video. But anyway, so the title reads, "One man exposed the secrets of the Freemasons. His disappearance led to their downfall." Right away, I don't know if the Freemasons of the United States were completely scrubbed out of existence. Actually, I know for a fact that they weren't, because I know a few Masons in real life. I myself am not a Freemason, but nor do I want to become one. But I have met some people in my life who still are in it. So for sure, they have not been scrubbed out. And I don't even know if they've been scrubbed out of positions of power, because this article makes it sound like they had such a strong grip on the United States government, even way before it became the United States. Well, anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So this article starts with it sets the scene of this guy named William Morgan. So this guy, William Morgan, was kind of blowing the whistle on the Freemasons of the time. And this was around the 1820s. William Morgan, he goes missing from the local jail, and he's a New York stoneworker, which is interesting because that's the stonemason, or the Freemasons were originally stonemasons, I think. Although I'll get to that in a second. I thought these secret societies went back even further. I know the Jesuits weren't started until the 1510s, 1520s, I think. It was by Loyola Ignatius, I think. I don't know. But I know that secret societies have been around for a long time, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essene Brotherhood, some other tribes that claim to have come from ancient Israel, the 12 Jewish tribes. But anyway, apparently this group though came also from the 1500s. They started in the 1500s from a group of stonemasons. Anyway, here's a description that I thought was interesting of Morgan. Morgan was not a man of importance. In fact, he was known as a bit of a drunk, a drifter who, according to a historian and author of American Hysteria, then the untold story of mass political extremism in the United States, Andrew Burt, had moved his family relentlessly throughout the countryside, hauling his wife, Lucinda, and 2 young children from one failed venture to the next. So they paint this guy out to be some failure. Although he had a wife and kids, he had a pretty bad reputation, and he had a drinking problem, as probably a lot of people did back in those days. He managed to infiltrate. The reason why he's so important is because he managed to infiltrate the secret society of the Freemasons and was threatening to publish a book exposing the powerful organization's tactics. As a result of this plan, the local Masons began harassing Morgan to stop the publication of the expose. Now, he sounds like Alex Jones. If you guys don't know who Alex Jones is, he's a well-known conspiracy theorist and not a reporter, but he runs his own news organization called InfoWars. But back in the day, like early 2000s, I think, he gained a lot of notoriety for storming the Bilderberg group, the Bilderberg meeting. And he got in, and then he got some footage, some actual video footage of what was going on behind closed doors with that organization. And he's still standing today. I mean, he's still talking, he's still reporting. He hasn't been silenced. Although he's been taken off YouTube, I think, and he's been deplatformed, but he's still going. This guy seems like the first Alex Jones, because he and another guy, they teamed up and they held this threat above the heads of the Freemasons, which he was a stoneworker. Perhaps he had an axe to grind, and maybe he was left out of the Freemasons, or he had some grudge against them, as did a lot of people in those days. I mean, according to this article, they were holding a lot of prominent positions of power in the U.S. So anyway, the Masons harassed him, and he was held prisoner on trumped up charges. So it doesn't go into detail what the charges were. They do go over other charges, but these initial charges they don't go over. But anyway, he was bailed out by the Masons themselves and then carried away right after, never to be seen again. So this caused this incident caused a huge anti-Mason sentiment especially in New York, and it led to a national anti-Mason movement. So even I think John Quincy Adams was coming out as an anti-Mason guy, and they've created their own political party. They held their own national convention, the first third party to hold their the first party period to have their own national convention. And now, we have the Democratic National Convention, we have the Republican National Convention, and all that stuff. So anyway, continuing on, long before the Freemasons became a flashpoint in early 19th century politics, the order was a humble stoneworkers organization believed to have been formed in England and Scotland in the 1500s. So yeah, around this time, a lot of secret societies were being formed. I talked about the Jesuits. I'm guessing these stoneworkers are different, although they might be connected. Who knows? They started underground, so who knows the extent of their network. I know that there are some secret societies that still exist today that claim to date back to ancient Egypt. And during the Middle Ages, there were schools of Kabbalah, these traveling mystics who developed like tarot cards and all that stuff, and they had advanced knowledge of astronomy and astrology back before it was considered a pseudoscience. These groups are definitely around. I don't know if a lot of people. I know enough to know not to clump them all up into one group. But as far as how many groups there are, who knows? There's also Skull and Bones, which is a lot later in American history, and that's the big conspiracy that like Prescott Bush and the entire Bush family is involved in that, or something like that. But I don't know if these are the same guys. Actually, I'm pretty sure they're not the same. But anyway, I'm just trying to fill in some context for you guys if you have no idea what I'm talking about. The organization soon took on a more philosophical air, using the principles of stonemasonry as a guiding metaphor in order to secretly assist its members in other areas of business and society. And we see that today, right? I mentioned fraternities and sororities. They're established in that same way. There's like some sort of rite of passage, and then once you're initiated, there's like not really a caste system, but there's like a ranking system of seniority. And then once you come out the other end and graduate, you have all these inroads into getting ahead professionally and all that stuff. The first Masonic lodges began showing up in the colonies in the early 1700s, and then they swiftly gained power and influence. Now, I want to analyze that for a second. Let's look at the early pilgrims and the early settlers of the colonial days of the colonies, and the people who made up the population back then, they were a certain type of person. Like these were you're either really religious, or you had nothing to lose by taking the risk and going across the pond and setting up shop in a completely new and foreign land. And the people that did, they were of a certain, it could be argued that they're a type of personality that makes up that population, whether it's out of desperation, whether it's greed, whether it's religious, whatever it is, most of them are trying to get ahead. So it makes sense that a group that are Freemasons would come in and start recruiting people to almost like a first mover's advantage, so to speak. So right away, these Freemasons were they were propagating. Members of the Freemasons eventually played a pivotal role in the formation of the United States. This is actually true. George Washington was a Freemason. I think Thomas Jefferson was. 13 of the 39 signatures on the U.S. Constitution belonged to Masons, and by the time Morgan disappeared in the 1820s, it had representatives entrenched at every level of the country's social, economic, and political hierarchies, especially in New York. So he doesn't cite any documentation, but I've heard this as well from other sources that Masons were, those types of Masons anyway, were everywhere in government. So Morgan, he teamed up with this guy named David Miller, who was a local newspaper publisher. He had his own printing press. The successful Freemasons presented a daily reminder of wealth that seemed, for them, meaning Morgan and Miller, simply unattainable. So maybe that was part of their axe to grind. Again, all this stuff that we're going over, it might... you guys know the saying... history is written by the victors. So maybe this is all revisionist history, and maybe they had other reasons than the one stated in this article for them to, I guess, have a chip on their shoulder when it came to the Freemasons. But anyway, all I can do is go over what's reported here. So I don't want to be called a shill or anything like that. So A.P. Bentley wrote in his 1874 book, History of Abduction of William Morgan. So this guy wrote a book about this whole William Morgan controversy, and then in it he says the two men entered a partnership to print a book which the public was to be told disclose the secrets of Masonry in hopes to make a fortune out of the gaping curiosity of the vulgar. So this is a very American thing, right? To capitalize on interest and demand, and make a lot of money off of it, right? Capitalism. So it seems like either one of two things was happening. Morgan and Miller, they had a grudge against the Masons, and they wanted to expose them, and they really felt like the Masons had some crazy like human sacrifice rituals or something utterly horrifying, and they wanted to expose it. Or they were they were kind of like promoters trying to create interest in something that may or may not be true, and just sell books and everything, mainly built at the time books, to capitalize on the interest. And remember, there's no TV, there's no real I don't even think vaudeville was a thing yet, so this was very gripping if you were in the public, if you're just a normal guy. Under false pretenses of being a Mason himself, Morgan gained access to the local lodge and documented several of the organization's cryptic ceremonies and induction rituals. So this is where it gets really Alex Jonesy, right? So Morgan somehow poses as a Mason, he gets through, and he's a stoneworker, so maybe that helped him somehow to get in. Or maybe he was already a Mason and they just didn't talk about it, and then he decided to go back on his word or whatever. So he gets in, he starts writing down all the details on paper, and then once he gets out, Miller begins saying, hey, we got all this stuff, we got all this information, and he just starts hyping it up before actually releasing it. And I think that's a bad move in hindsight, like if I was them, because that gave the Masons time to retaliate. They should have just kept quiet. So I don't know if this is what exactly happened, but if it did, then I think that's a bad move. Miller kept hinting at the incendiary nature of the upcoming expose, saying he had discovered the strongest evidence of rottenness in the centuries-old institution. Miller and Morgan's threat to reveal the innermost secrets of the Masons spread quickly, and every neighboring county Masonic chapters were soon gripped with panic, fear, and outrage. So it was actually working. The Masons were like, oh wow. They were very defensive of what happened, so they reacted accordingly. So maybe there really was some crazy things going on, and these guys were willing to throw the dice to make money off of it, but one guy ended up getting killed. eventually, which is Morgan. As the published date approached, the Masons began a targeted campaign of harassment against the two would-be book publishers. So they're a smear campaign, I guess, or in this case, I think they sent some thugs over to Miller's office, where his printing press was, and like set it on fire. Law enforcement officers loyal to the Freemasons arrested and jailed Morgan and Miller for outstanding debts. If you're going to get somebody, that's how you would do it, I guess, because that's one of the few ways there's a paper trail leading back to you if somebody like a compromised law enforcement officer wanted to get you in jail. I mean, with Al Capone, they sort of did that by getting him on, not all the terrible things that Al Capone did, they got him on tax evasion or something like that. Yeah. So very similar in this case. I don't even know if that's true or not. If Morgan and Miller did have outstanding debts, but if they did, that's how they got them. September 11th, a gang of Masons showed up at Morgan's house with an arrest warrant for petty larceny. So he gets bailed. No. He doesn't get bailed. This is when he's about to go to jail the first time. It says that he borrowed a shirt and tie from the owner of the local tavern and never returned it. I don't know how common it is to borrow clothing from other people back in those days. But if it isn't, then that's ridiculous that they got him for that. But I don't know. Maybe that was a normal thing. Maybe people borrowed shoes from each other and stuff too. Soon after he arrived at the police station, the charges were dropped. But Morgan was immediately arrested for another petty debt of $2.65. And he couldn't just pay it on the spot, I guess. They wouldn't let him, so they just kept him in jail. And then he was bailed out by the group of Masons that I mentioned earlier, led by Lawton Lawson. And they kidnapped him, and he was never seen again. He was escorted into a carriage and never seen again. He was yelling murder. That's what he was saying. I don't know if that's exactly what he was saying, but that's the story now. His disappearance spread throughout New York. So how did something like this spread throughout New York so quickly? Was it just Miller? I mean, if the cops were compromised and then there were a group of guys from the Masons who took him, how did word still get out unless there was like eyewitness testimony or something? This is why it makes me think that the Masons, again, the revisionist history, or they deliberately made it seem like Morgan's disappearance, they helped spread that for whatever reason. Because organically, I don't know how that would get out. Maybe there was a few onlookers or something. With each new county that heard the news, it seemed that brutality and drama of the kidnapping grew exponentially, while the desire to portray it accurately diminished at a similar rate. So this is kind of like the game of telephone, right? When you start with truth and you pass it on to a bunch of different people in the line, by the time you get to the other end of the line, the story is going to have changed drastically in some cases. So this might be what's going on here as well. The insular, secretive, powerful Masons, as Bert described, soon became a popular symbol of everything that was wrong with the country. So the Masons got this bad rap, so much so that the accused men were put on trial, but they were given lenient sentences. They received prison terms ranging from 1 month to 2 years. And the ones who were convicted were, quote, forcibly moving Morgan from one place to another against his will. And that, I think, is grounds for kidnapping. So if I grabbed somebody in my living room against their will and moved them into the bathroom against their will, technically that would be kidnapping, I would assume. The all-powerful Masons had, in the eyes of those who opposed them, gotten away with murder. Everybody loves a good conspiracy story, and that was the initial spark. Headlines, outrage, crimes, and murder. It didn't take long before a movement was born. So stuff like this, publicity stunts or false flags, all of these things really do work in the sense that it generates a lot of either pushback or a strong reaction from the general public. But the public has to be made aware of it for it to work. So the event, this had to have been national headlines that this was going on. And how does that work, especially back then? Since if you had your own printing press, then you were basically free to print whatever you wanted. So how many independent printing presses were there back then, and how many of them had to report the same story enough to get it to into the heads of the national public? So they don't go over these questions in this article. In either case, the outrage led to calls for political action. Citizens from all over New York State met and declared their intent to stop voting for candidates with Masonic ties. So it doesn't look good for the Freemasons here, right? So they wanted to vote them out. The sentiment extended to the media as well, as Mason-owned newspapers were boycotted. I mean, these are the only ones. The Mason-owned newspapers were boycotted, but what if there were some that they didn't know were Mason-owned and they just kept quiet? You know, that's what I think might have happened, especially if the Masons were already occupying the vast majority of the government seats and the government positions of power. I don't know. It's really hard to sift through see if whether the general public was successful in scrubbing them out or not. But this next part is very telling. As early as the next elections in 1828, anti-Masonic candidates were winning offices all over the country, or people who came out as anti-Masonic. Who knows? You could have been a Mason and then a closet Mason and just declared yourself out in the open that you were anti-Masonic. So who knows? Who knows who was really Masonic and who wasn't? Even the sitting president, John Quincy Adams, declared that he had never been and would never be a Mason. The anti-Masonic Party, considered America's first third party, officially had gone national. In 1830, they held a presidential nominating convention, which eventually was adopted by other parties. But infighting over who to nominate and how to expand the party's core platform to other issues other than hating the Masons led to its demise. It got crushed under its own weight. They couldn't come to agreements on stuff, because they were only united by their hate for the Masons. So that makes a lot of sense. If you're number one, if you're a political party and you want to attract like-minded people who share the same principles as you, morals, all that stuff, ethics, then you might be better off than, say, a movement that's united by hate, especially a laser focus on one issue. And this issue was anti-Masonic people. So same thing with the Nazis, right? Well, the Nazis are a lot more, I think they're a lot more complex, and we have a lot more information about them than these guys. But one of their main platforms was hate for Jews and people who weren't of the Aryan race. So, and that, of course, collapsed under itself as well. Not just under itself. It took the Allies in World War II to deal with them, and even that is debatable. Some people think that they're still around. Some people think they escaped to Argentina. Some people, all that stuff could be true for sure. People think Hitler left and lived a long life. But anyway, although the Masons still exist, the organization is a shadow of its former self. I don't know about that. Maybe I feel like there are a lot of Masons out there still. I mean, there are like 3 Masonic lodges around here. Now, I don't know if they are the same as this group of Freemasons or if they branched off or something like that. I don't know too much about it. But all I know is that I see a lot of Freemason lodges around, and I know of a handful of people who are Masons. So if I know a handful of Masons, then there are probably other people who know Masons as well. And that alone makes me feel like there are at least a good number of them out there. I'm not saying they're bad or good either. Some people think it's just a glorified drinking club. Either way, they are still around. And some of you guys viewing might be a Freemason. Who knows? So the book itself that came out, it was tame compared to stuff today. Morgan gave a word-for-word account of a rather dull lodge opening ceremony, and then he also revealed that prospective members had to sign and declare an oath of loyalty to the Masons, punishable by death. The senior deacon, according to Morgan, was poking the exposed chest of a newly appointed member with the tip of a compass and issued the following threat. as this is a torture to your flesh, so may it be your mind and conscience if ever you should attempt to reveal the secrets of the Masonry unlawfully. So what secrets could they have that they did not want to get out? If I had to guess, it's probably something like human sacrifice or something egregious, killing babies, something like that. So it had to be something that would overwhelmingly be negative, no matter what background you're from. It has to be repulsive across the board. Otherwise, why would they care? Or maybe they have hidden death ray technology, or some technology that I can't even think of an example, but some technology that's a game changer. I don't know. But honestly, it's probably something egregious, probably kidnapping people or killing people or something like that. The book was a bestseller despite the tameness of what was out. Although there was probably nothing like it before then, so who knows. Unfortunately, Morgan was around to enjoy any of it. Yeah, he was dead. All this is after. Some people think that he assumed a new identity and fled to Canada, or maybe he was executed as a pirate in the Cayman Islands. I don't know what the story is with William Morgan. Maybe all they know is that they took him away from a carriage. If this is a publicity stunt by the Freemasons for whatever reason, I feel like there's a whole nother part of the story that I'm not getting from this. But the fact of the matter is they didn't find the body of William Morgan, who, by the way, looks like this. This is William Morgan here. Check out the 10 head that he has. That's awesome. And those tiny glasses. This dude doesn't seem like again, this is an illustration, but he doesn't seem like a drunk or anything like that. He seems like maybe he did have some information. Maybe this whole thing was his idea. He just wanted to get out of the U.S. and maybe he had more other debts that he wanted to get out of. Because he was a stoneworker, which is interesting. So I don't know if you guys have any information about this story, anything you want to add about American Freemasons. Please feel free to answer in the leave a comment rather. I don't think I have time to go over a comment. Let's just go over a comment real quick. Yeah, in my last video, I talked about the Phoenicians, and Bill left a pretty interesting comment. Let me zoom in on it. So he says, the Phoenicians are very interesting. It's strange at how important they seem, and yet we know so little about them. It makes me think there's an attempt to make people forget about them. So that's something I didn't think of. Maybe they did want to delete their own culture from the memory of humans. He also says the name of the Bible may come from their city called Byblos, which I've heard that as well. They were excellent shipbuilders. Their government structure was very free and entrepreneurial. They were a group of city-states that did not have a strong central government. This is all the stuff that we know about the Phoenicians, which is far outweighed by what we don't know. Then he talks about there's evidence of copper mining in North America that dates to the Bronze Age, but there is no evidence of its usage. So perhaps the Phoenicians, with their advanced maritime technology, they were probably going to and from North America to get that bronze, or that copper rather. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's an interesting possibility because it would fill a few gaps in history, and it would have been definitely a lucrative trade route that if the Phoenicians were indeed doing that, then they would have protected it as a trade secret, which is a good point. And then Columbus may have had some ancient source maps that allowed him to know about the New World before he actually set sail. And perhaps these source maps were first came from the Phoenicians. And part of the reason why he thinks that is because people from Cadiz say that was initially a colony of the Phoenicians at one point. And if that were true, that'd be very interesting. Now, the only way we can really prove this is to find some Phoenician copper and somehow trace it back to North America. That would be really interesting if that were true. That would completely change history. So anyway, let me know what you guys think. That was a great comment, by the way, Bill. Thank you so much for your continued support. You're the man. Yeah, let me know what you guys think about Masons or the Phoenicians or whatever. And I'll talk to you guys next week.